We've just seen, I think maybe you've just seen, this so-called Inflation Reduction Act. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm still reviewing the legislation in full and going through Manchin's proposal in detail, but I'll tell you this. One area where I know Senator Manchin and I agree strongly is on the importance of having a strong industrial base and an energy-independent United States. The legislation that you've covered extensively, but I introduced last year to boost domestic manufacturing of solar technology and solar products appears to be in the draft that Senator Manchin has circulated. This also includes investment and expansion of nuclear energy production in the United States, and that's encouraging. We are heavily reliant upon imported solar products, and the supply chain that China's taken control over, all the way from polysilicon to ingots to wafers to cells to modules, that makes us dependent upon imports for this strategic commodity, because solar technology is now a matter of our strategic national interest. We need to be producing these products in the United States, and that's why I'm pleased that my legislation is included in this draft text.
Well, as you suggest, Senator, you and I have talked about this before, and I know you're very intent on developing Georgia as a place for solar technology. What specifically, as far as you can tell from what you've seen so far, would this new piece of legislation do for Georgia as a solar source?
Well, the text that I've reviewed thus far, but Senator Manchin has circulated, includes the legislation that I introduced last year to boost American solar manufacturing. Georgia does host the largest solar panel manufacturing facility in the Western Hemisphere. But we also have to be thinking more broadly about the entire energy sector, about all classes of renewables, and about nuclear energy, which is going to be a vital part of our nation's energy mix as we continue to transition toward less and less reliance on fossil fuels.
Let's talk about the politics of it if we could, because you got to get it passed. And certainly Senator Joe Manchin is critically important to doing that. I'm not sure he can do it all by himself. You need to get every other Democratic senator to go along in reconciliation. And by the way, you need to get the House as well. What are the issues that you see that could be stumbling blocks for that? For example, one that's important to a lot of people at Bloomberg is the carried interest rule. People have tried to do that forever and never gotten it done.
Well, like I said, I'm still going through all of these provisions in detail, including the tax components. But broadly speaking, here's what I'm seeing thus far. A significant measure of deficit reduction. For the first time in decades, real action to reduce the cost of prescriptions paid by Americans at the pharmacy, which is a source of great frustration, injustice, and bad health outcomes for Americans across the country. And these investments in America's energy independence and domestic industrial base that are vital to our long-term prosperity, as well as in our strategic national security interests. I'm sure there will be robust discussion as the next week unfolds about each of these provisions. I will continue to look at them in full. Thus far, I'm encouraged by the broad scope and the general framework that's been presented, but I'm going to do my due diligence before I vote on the floor. As
with any piece of legislation, you know better than I, Senator, there's compromises to be made. In order to get the votes you need, you go various ways. There's a lot of money in here for clean energy. There are also reports of some compromises on things like permitting, some things, concessions to fossil fuels. Is that the sort of compromise you think that will be appealing to people who are concerned about the climate?
Look, I think that the American people are realistic about how this transition is going to unfold. We are seeing right now that countries that don't have the capacity to produce the forms of energy that are most intensively used now are at a strategic disadvantage. At the same time, one of the things that's driven inflation is the oil and gas intensity of current modes of production and transportation. So yes, America needs a reliable supply of the energy sources that are dominant today, but it's urgent that we accelerate the transition toward greater adoption of renewables and nuclear so that we're not held hostage by petrostates, whether they're in the Middle East or in Russia, in future geostrategic competition.
Senator, when you take the CHIPS Act, which appears to be making its way to the president's desk, and you put it together with this Inflation Reduction Act, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars being spent by the U.S. government. Do you get any pushback from your constituents in Georgia saying, you know what, we've got a lot of inflation, the last thing we need right now is for the government to spend a lot more money?
Well, Georgians and I think all Americans expect Congress to act in a fiscally responsible way, and that's why, again, while I'm still reviewing the text in detail, I'm encouraged that this legislation includes a significant measure of deficit reduction, because it's important that we keep our fiscal house in order.
We got GDP numbers out today, as you know, second straight quarter of negative growth. That doesn't necessarily mean we're in a recession, but things clearly seem to be slowing down. That's what we heard from Chair Powell yesterday, actually, that things are slowing down. Are you seeing it in Georgia, and particularly, are you seeing it in employment situations in Georgia?
Look, thus far in Georgia and across the country, we're seeing continued strength in the labor market. Of course, we're watching the growth data very carefully. And I have to say, I was asking Chair Powell repeatedly in banking committee hearings throughout the second half of last year, as you covered, why the Fed maintained such a dovish posture in the face of sustained inflation. That's now water under the bridge. The Fed is rushing to catch up. And when the Fed is rushing, that means that there are potential risks to financial stability, potential risks to growth, potential risks to the employment.
Senator, I want to really cover one other thing before we let you go, and that's something you've been involved in. I'll frankly admit I hadn't paid much attention to it. You are the head of the subcommittee of the Homeland Security Committee looking into the federal prison system and some real problems starting in Georgia, maybe not limited to Georgia. Take us through what you've looked at, what you found.
Well, I chair the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. It was established by Harry Truman in the 1940s to investigate war profiteering during World War II, and it is the lead investigative body in the U.S. Senate. And in that capacity, I have led a 10-month bipartisan investigation of corruption, abuse, and misconduct in the federal prison system, focused on U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta in my home state of Georgia. And having reviewed thousands of pages of internal government records, interviewed dozens of witnesses, including whistleblowers from within the Bureau of Prisons, what's clear is that for at least 9 years, serious misconduct, abuse, and corruption have prevailed in this major federal prison facility. The Bureau of Prisons knew about it, their leadership had access to this information, and for years they let it continue. This is a facility that has been rife with weapons and drugs enabled by staff corruption, criminal conduct within the prison at an appalling rate, inhumane and abusive conditions, including for pre-trial, presumptively innocent detainees, folks who have been convicted of no crime, crowded into cells, crawling with vermin, emaciated from malnutrition, without access to clean drinking water, hygiene products, or health care. Our prison system is a disgrace to the U.S. government. That is why I will continue to lead bipartisan oversight and bipartisan investigations.
So, Senator, from your investigation and you're studying this, how did we get here? Because some of the descriptions I've read, summarized here, sound like a 19th century prison, not something in 2022.
Well, the truth of the matter, I think, David, is that these conditions have prevailed in many U.S. prisons for decades and decades. There has been a consistent failure by the U.S. government to ensure that there is integrity, that the rule of law and order are respected within these facilities, and that there is humane treatment of detainees and inmates consistent with constitutional guarantees and civil rights. But that's why I'm leading this bipartisan oversight work, because the Congress does not do enough effective, tenacious, bipartisan oversight of the executive branch. In my capacity as the chair of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, I will continue to investigate corruption and misconduct in the federal government, and I will use all of the lawful authorities I have as the chair of the subcommittee to find the facts, get the testimony and records that we need.